Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the UBC Learning Circle, hosted by the Centre for Excellence in Indigenous Health. Today we have Andrea and Len here from the First Nations Health Authority, and they're going to be talking about Indigenous perspectives on healthy sexuality. So I'd first like to acknowledge the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people, whose lands we're on today. I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations Health Authority for funding the Learning Circle. So to introduce myself again, my name is Melanie Rivers, Mlamowit. I'm from the Squamish Nation, and I'm the Education Coordinator with the Learning Circle. So really pleased to have Andrea and Len back. They were here, I think, last month or the month before, talking about the overdose crisis. They work with the Indigenous Wellness Team at the First Nations Health Authority, and they spend a lot of time traveling out to First Nations communities and doing workshops and holding conversations and around topics like healthy sexuality and harm reduction and overdose. So I'm really pleased to have you both back. And so I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Len Pierre, and I am Coast Salish from Katzie First Nation, and I am the cultural designer with the Indigenous Wellness Team.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Andrea Medley, Gudakoyas, and I'm from the Haida Nation of Olmassit. I'm the educator on the Indigenous Wellness Team, and we're really happy to be back.
Thank you for having us back. We love it here. Our Indigenous Wellness Team at the First Nations Health Authority is an education and training program for everything in harm reduction and healthy sexuality. What kind of makes us a little bit different for how we do our work across the province with each of our Indigenous communities is that we take regular healthcare curriculum and then we infuse it with Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values. That is really as local to the territory as we can wherever we're facilitating our conversations. Very similar to our harm reduction conversations when we were here a month ago. We hold conversation at the heart of everything that we do. So fluidity, flexibility is at the core of everything we do. So any questions that come to mind, please feel free to ask them as we go.
This is a little overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to share some background on our team and the work that we've been doing around healthy sexuality. We're going to share another model, our sexual well-being model, and the way that we talk about our approach to conversations around healthy sexuality in a culturally safe and relevant way. We're going to be talking about sex positivity, inclusivity, and trauma-informed care, and we'll end with sharing some approaches to support conversations around healthy sexuality in our communities.
So a little bit of who we are and what we've been up to. Our Indigenous Wellness program at First Nations Health Authority was created 2 years ago in April 2016, which was the exact same time where our public health care emergency was declared in overdoses that we've been seeing across the province. So with harm reduction being half of our training and education mandate, the opioid crisis has taken up a great deal of the type of training and education that we offer in communities. But we're happy wherever we're invited to facilitate conversations on healthy sexuality through an Indigenous lens. Over the last 2 years, we've really emphasized on gathering and supporting the resurgence of Indigenous healthy sexuality. So a year ago, we hosted our very first ever Indigenous Sexual Health Educators Gathering by finding Indigenous people that are sex educators in their own communities or in certain lines of work, and we gathered together to talk about the healthcare curriculum that we deliver, but really analyze it through an Indigenous lens and what it means for our traditions and what it means for our culture here in the province. Everything that we do, we emphasize on partnerships and building relationships, so we work very closely with what we call our cousin programs. And those cousin programs are friends and relatives at Chimamuk, that is housed at BC CDC. We also work very closely with the Youth Notice program that is housed at YouthCo here in Vancouver, as well as the Indigenous Wellness program at PHSA. And again, just to honor tradition and culture wherever we go, we hold cultural knowledge and values in everything that we do.
So, why wellness and why sexual well-being? So, as Len was talking about, a lot of the curriculum that we're working with has come from public health, and we're working to kind of indigenize it and come from that cultural perspective. And in acknowledging this, so much of education around healthy sexuality has been quite fear-based, quite stigmatizing, disease and deficit-based, or just solely focuses on reproduction rather than that holistic model of what healthy sexuality is and how it interrelates to our whole lives. So we like to start our conversations with talking about our BC First Nations perspective on wellness model and looking at the intersections between emotional, physical, spiritual, and cultural health, because for a long time we just talked about healthy sexuality in terms of physical aspects, but looking at it from a holistic Indigenous perspective, we know that there's linkages between those spiritual, mental, and emotional pieces as well. We like to focus on strength and resiliency, and the picture on the top there is our last Indigenous sexual health educators gathering. The picture on the top right corner is Kayla and myself. Kayla's the program manager at Yostamus. We're doing a youth presentation, I think, at Gathering Our Voices. And the other part of this work is that we've primarily only been asked so far to do youth presentations. And so for our team, we also want to acknowledge that these conversations about healthy sexuality can and probably should be happening across different ages and different age groups. So how do we support conversations with community members, with elders as well? And I think that's something that our team is thinking about, and how to foster these important conversations and to kind of normalize these conversations. And I think we'll get into that a little bit more.
This is our sexual well-being model that we've developed to kind of be like a learning tool to act as a platform or hosting these conversations around healthy sexuality through an Indigenous lens. So what you see in this image is four distinct faces. They have very subtle differences, if you notice, in their forehead. But each of the faces really recognizes and honors what we call the sexual health intersection. And that's looking at sexual well-being more holistically, is that it is not, a sole and separate component of one's health. Rather, it intersects with all other aspects of one's health and wellness. So that is represented by these four core areas. That is identity, healthy relationships, protecting our communities, as well as adulthood and rites of passage. As Andrea was saying, is that quite often our conversations around healthy sexuality really get focused and concentrated around youth programming and youth education, but we know that healthy sexuality is continues on through our lifetime. And so in conversations we've had with elders, is that it's really important that we get back to a place where we recognize conversations around healthy sexuality in all four of our life cycles throughout our lifetime. And so that first life cycle is infancy and childhood. Healthy sexuality has a part to play there. Youth, and then adulthood, and then when we are when we become elders. So when we see holism around healthy sexuality, we open the door for lifelong learning about our own wellness, and then we break the barriers to talking about significant issues that pertain to our daily lives, like mental wellness, self-esteem, balance within our relationships, and caring for your body mentally, spiritually, physically, and emotionally.
And I think in preparing this presentation, we found there were so many similarities between our harm reduction model and our ways of looking at harm reduction. So the first component of the model is around identity, and we're hearing more and more about different ways of identifying, and there's lots of vocabulary around identity and gender gender expression, and we don't want to list exhaustive terminology around it because we don't have it, and also I think we want to talk about our approach to understanding and learning more about this and supporting people in our lives by educating ourselves around this, and by hosting conversations and working to be an open person around having conversations around identity. So some of the main ideas are looking at the importance of body autonomy and decision making, that we are in control of our own bodies and we make the decisions for our bodies. Looking at natural versus a shame-based perspective, so what happens in the natural world and what happens to our bodies is natural, and those processes around it, and how they became kind of shame-based and shameful, and now we're not really having conversations around identity and our bodies and body positivity, and that's really through looking at how colonization has impacted our Indigenous identities and really imposed these binary ways of looking at the world. So what this can look like for us is learning more about that inclusive language around gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, and that these are all different pieces. Asking pronouns, if it's a safe place to ask, that's not always the case. So a pronoun is how a person describes their gender, and how it's not something that we should never assume, because we'll be sharing a slide just right after this that kind of breaks down the difference between gender identity, expression, and sexual orientation. But basically, just by looking at someone, you can't assume our pronouns. So if it's a safe place, then we should be asking, not assuming. Going beyond heteronormative teachings when we're talking about sexual health, and being aware of the way that we talk about body parts, and making sure that we're using inclusive language. Exercising patience. As humans, we change and we grow and we're flexible, and so I think it's important to think about having patience with ourselves and with the people in our lives as they change and grow and develop as well. And using, again, that mindful judgment. So as we talk about in our harm reduction work, that it's basically impossible to be non-judgmental. We all have judgments as we work through the world, so examining and thinking about whether those judgments are helpful or not helpful, and whether they're supportive or not supportive, and just thinking about our own values and ideas around these topics of conversation, to make sure that we can have these conversations in an open and safe way.
Can you explain
sorry, go ahead.
Can you explain a little bit more what heteronormative means?
I have an example.
Awesome.
I was telling Andrea a story as we're preparing for coming in this morning around beyond heteronormative teachings, and they're actually quite subtle. And they're in our minds, and they're in our mental constructs. And so an example of heteronormative teachings is really looking at this male, female, binary. That's the only two ways. And then, of course, through colonization, it's this strong regard for men and masculinity over femininity. So an example I have is I was making a post on social media on my Instagram account, and I was just loving up my brothers, because I have two brothers and I was really missing them, and so I put a couple of pictures of me and my brothers together, and I just inserted my own quote that says, "I know the Creator loves me because He gave me brothers." And then I posted it, thinking that it was a really wonderful thing to post about my love for my brothers. But then I really was thinking about, challenging my own colonial, heteronormative teachings, and that I'm like, well, I referred to the Creator as a He, but where does that come from? And why is that so? And so after thinking about it instantly after posting that, I thought that it was not appropriate to refer to the creator as a he because of a colonial, value over masculinity over femininity. So I removed the he and I put in they. That I know the creator loves me because they gave me brothers. So it's just it's those subtle things of the way we think, and assuming, right, the assumption of a pronoun. And so another thing I like to refer to when we talk about identity conversations in our communities is that when we think about the MeToo movement and equality for men and women, but also like the equality when we talk about our LGBTQ2 communities, and we look at like it's this movement for equality, but when it's we think about things through our Indigenous lens and our tradition and our culture, it's really a restorative act in restoring the acceptance and flexibility and fluidity of identities within our communities.
Thank you.
So this is one kind of way of looking at how we might describe the differences between gender identity, gender expression, and biological sex. This model uses a spectrum, which maybe we wouldn't use, but it's a good visual just to show that there is a difference and that people can kind of zigzag throughout these different ways of identifying, and it's not one or the other, and that many people lie at various places between these sorts of spectrums. So I think it's something that's really good to be aware of, just because there is such a growing vocabulary and growing understanding, and some of the workshops we've had and the conversations we've had with communities, it's come to our attention, I guess, that younger people have typically a lot more progressive and have a lot more language and understanding around different identities and ways of being, and so sometimes it's hard when they're speaking to their parents or caregivers about it, and that's the first time the parents or caregivers have heard of these terminologies. So I think for us as caregivers, parents or loved ones, to think more about the different ways of identifying and to educate ourselves around terminology so that we can have these conversations and to support people in our lives that have different ways of identifying is really important.
Getting further into understanding how colonization has impacted our Indigenous identities, if we look at some of the issues that are happening in our communities today, we can make direct linkages between colonialism, very similar to the work that we presented with decolonizing addiction and the colonial events like residential schools, the 60s scoop, and land theft. It's easy to see that our colonial values around identity and how we value certain identities that really emphasize aggression, violence, strength and dominance, power over women, and it's a really strong sense of competition. And then of course, there's those remnants of rejection of homosexuality. But what does that look like through an Indigenous lens, or what would that look like pre-colonization? And that's where we see more balance, where we see nurturing and adaptability, where people feel free to emotionally express themselves, emphasizing reciprocal relationships over dominance, fluidity and flexibility, emphasizing cooperation over competition, and respect and high regard for two-spirit and other genders, and healthy masculinity over toxic masculinity. Another component that we have is called protecting communities, and that's really emphasizing social cohesion and togetherness. We might also call that tribalism in our communities. And we also identify this with one of our intergenerational strengths is that, we endured centuries since time immemorial by working together and taking care of one another. So we really look at healthy sexuality, starts with the self. And when we take care of ourselves and we're honoring our body sovereignty, we're aware of our body and what our body is capable of doing, and we integrate that with cultural knowledge, that makes us much more stronger to protect our family and our community and our loved ones. What this looks like is having healthy conversations about the concept of self. Why is it important to know about your body and awareness of your body sovereignty, and how that impacts and can influence your family and your community and the intimate relationships that you might have. But all centering around back to our Indigenous Wellness Wheel is the human being is at the middle, and that starts with every single one of us. And from there we can move into conversations about contraception, understanding how a condom is used, and then also very important conversations about resources that are close to home, so local in our territory. In particular, finding out where testing can be done, what treatment looks like, and of course education opportunities. And then expanding that to, so that the community has a greater awareness on HIV, hepatitis C, and other sexually transmitted infections.
So the next component that we have is looking at the importance of healthy relationships in our lives. And I think for this piece, we're not just talking about healthy relationships with partners or friends or the community, but also how do we foster and manifest a healthy relationship with ourselves. So looking at the pieces of respect and reciprocity, looking at relatedness and how we relate to one another and shared similarities, a balance between partners, and codependence versus interdependence. One of the key things about healthy relationships that sparked me was some of these connections to HIDA laws. So the first HIDA law is that is respect, that we treat everybody and everything with respect, and the second is that everything we do must have consent, and the third is that if we don't have respect or consent, then we have to make things right. And in this creation of this laws, I think they were speaking more to our relationships with the land and with each other, and I just thought it related so closely to talking about healthy relationships and is such a useful application. And so what healthy relationships can look like in our lives is reflecting on our own boundaries, having conversations about what consent looks like and what it doesn't look like, and part of that is through healthy communications and working on our own communication skills, and part of that too is self-care, ways that we look after ourselves, ways that we care for ourselves, and to take that time and reflect on all of these pieces.
And the last component of our sexual well-being model is around adulthood and rites of passage, which is really recognizing that, again, that healthy sexuality conversations and education is not solely concentrated around youth, but that we carry it on and we have rights and responsibilities as we progress through life, through all 4 cycles of our lives. And this really is about, developing and sustaining a supportive environment for these types of conversations at the dinner table, in the living room, in our community centers, in our health centers, and wherever we're having these conversations. Being really mindful about removing the stigma and judgment that can be directly linked to colonization. So being mindful about the way we're talking about certain things, if there's certain types of fear or shame that are kind of coming out of the conversations, is where we really want to be mindful and maybe take it a step back and try and steer the conversation back towards healthy and constructive. And then, of course, reflecting on emotional, physical, spiritual, and mental areas as well. What this looks like is having mindful conversations about healthy sexuality within relationships, families, and communities. A great example I have of that is I have an 11-year-old daughter, and she is going to be going into grade 7 next year. And so we're starting to reach all these milestones that are leading up into, youthhood. Just in conversations I've had within the family is that we're very mindful about the conversations we have about the future. So we're very mindful about, when it's time for, my daughter to choose a partner, we say partner and not boyfriend or girlfriend. It's partner, so that openness and that acceptance is there. And same thing when, I think it's, quite comical in our communities where we joke around with younger generations about finding a partner and getting married. But marriage is also something that is, an option. But it's something that we emphasize very strongly in our communities, is that somebody's going to get married to somebody, or arranged marriages and those types of inside jokes we have in our community. But being mindful about that because of the authenticity is, does it align with the person? And we don't always know, so we don't assume. It's about creating learning opportunities for all 4 cycles of our lives and restoring traditional teachings of healthy sexuality based on our culture and our territory.
And the elder that we worked with at our sexual health educators gathering, he talked about acknowledging also the responsibility that comes with this transition into adulthood and the different types of relationships that we have. And another piece of adulthood and rites of passage is that in many of our nations we had different ceremonies and different rites of passage that came with our life changes as well. And there are many nations that are restoring these traditional teachings and ceremonies, such as the puberty ceremony.
It also just kind of comes to mind, the importance of it takes a community to raise a child, but it also takes a community to support a community. Type of teachings that we have in our community is that, when we look at the way our society has gone, is that, it's always important to, look for and recognize that sometimes within ourselves we may not be the best people to have certain conversations with certain people, but building a good, healthy network of people that are in the community. So I'm just reflecting on our elder Herb Joe's teachings that he shared with us, is that elders would take on, so aunties and uncles and grandparents would take on certain roles to help lead those types of conversations. So if if there's a single mom raising a son who has a lot of questions about life, it was within our Solo culture, our Coast Salish culture, that there would be brothers and uncles and grandparents to call upon. So being mindful about building a list of safe people to have safe conversations with as well.
Do you want a couple of questions or comments at this point, or do you want to wait till the end?
I think this is a good
time
for
sure.
any
Yeah.
questions. Yeah.
So there's a comment about mindful conversations, and what a fantastic concept. One around lately, I've heard the elders discussing safety around our ceremonies, and that there are predatory men and women in power looking for vulnerable people at ceremonies. And a question: what are some ideas on getting youth to the table to discuss this?
I think that's coming. Yeah.
That's great.
Cool. Yeah, those are really great questions and great to reflect on. So these are some shared teachings that we have. So when we're facilitating healthy sexuality programming, or even conversations with friends and family, we suggest considering these 3 pieces: sex positive, trauma informed, and inclusive, or STI, as Glenn pointed out.
Inside joke for a sexual health educator.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
So the key thing about being sex positive is this quote that I really found helpful in describing what that means. So you can be sex positive even if you're not having sex at all, as long as you don't judge others for their sexual choices or try to control their sexual choices, because we all have that body sovereignty that we talked about, and we want to be mindful and we want to be supportive. So we're going to kind of break these down in more detail. So shared teachings for best practices. So if we're practicing sex positivity, then we want to work towards being open and a safe person to have these conversations with. And in doing so, we have to be accepting and be accepting of the different ways that people identify, and the different ways of being, even if they're not our own, and to learn more about the different ways of identifying. We also need to have healthy and constructive conversations and to use that mindful judgment. So to be trauma informed, we need to work to create a safe environment. And looking at creating a safe environment would be learning more about identity and creating a space for anonymity as well is part of being trauma informed. And looking at the importance of choice, because we all need choices, and choices help to make us feel safe in the decisions that we're making.
Some examples for trauma-informed practice. One for creating a safe environment is, could be creating a group guidelines before starting a healthy sexuality workshop. And creating group guidelines is something, it's like really great for intention setting and safety setting before we have very sensitive and complex conversations. And so when you open up, what are some collective rules that we can all come up with? People can come up with great things like using respectful language. Youth Co and our cousins at Yasnoas have this really great saying where it's "don't yuck my yum," which is really because when we're talking about sexuality, there's diversity and there's differences, and making sure that you're not shaming or discouraging somebody else's voice at the table because you don't agree with their preference or what they enjoy is one example. And then space for anonymity. Say that word. Is having a suggestion box or a question box that you can write questions and then have them addressed anonymously in front of the group. And of course, always offering opportunities for choice. Our own body, our own choices. We don't always have to say our piece or do the physical activity that might be involved in the workshop, but making sure that there's also some opportunities for choice.
And I think as well, choice and anonymity are very important too when we're talking about access to testing and treatment, and as healthcare providers, how we can make sure that there is space for being anonymous and choice. And we've heard lots of creative ways around providing anonymity and choice, such as allowing people to kind of go through a different door in the health center where they don't have to see the receptionist, or meeting people outside of those four walls as well. So the last piece of our sex positive, trauma informed, inclusive teachings is about using inclusive language, and we talked a bit about what that looked like earlier. And then asking versus assuming. So asking those questions if there's a safe space, asking about pronouns, asking about how the person we're working with would like to be referred to, and looking at the importance of ongoing education, because as we have more of a space to have these conversations in society, there's growing vocabulary, growing terminologies, and it's up to us to educate ourselves around that.
Just some tips and tricks that we have for what we like to keep in mind when we're engaging in these types of conversations is really connecting with the resources that are around us in our community, and also making sure that the community is aware of where those resources are and that they're active and accessible. being mindful about the opportunities for knowledge shares as often as we can. Sometimes, when we're in a place of providing services, we can get discouraged if, one or two people show up to, an event that we're holding. But being mindful that the knowledge access is accessible. Emphasizing on guest speakers. So I think, we don't expect anybody to be an expert in any particular area of healthy sexuality, but when it comes to certain things, emphasizing on, building relationships with guest speakers to come in and talk about, so we had an elder to come speak with us about what healthy sexuality looks like through a cultural lens, and then we also had a transgendered woman come speak to our group about what that looks like and what their story was. So that we're honoring people with lived experience. Really looking at going beyond boys and girls groups because that's binary and not everybody's going to fit into those two groups within our communities. So what does that look like for our community? And everything at the center is hosting a conversation, that questions can be asked and answered, and that we learn together, emphasizing a reciprocal relationship that, while we can be standing there as facilitators, we're also learning at the same time. And of course, always remembering the STI, sex positive, trauma informed, and inclusive.
And I think the great thing too about the guest speakers, and especially the guest speakers that you mentioned that we had at our educators gathering, was that the storytelling that they did and how that really spoke to the heart and the mind, and how that was really transformative for many of the people there. So this is our sexual well-being learning model. So it has some of the pieces that we talked about, and on the opposite side, which is on the right, how to work with the model. It's now live on our website, fnha.ca/sexual-wellbeing. These are several resources that we put together. So some of the groups Len mentioned that we work with quite closely, Yostumas, PHSA, Indigenous Health, and Chimamuk. For further resources, there's the Native Youth Sexual Health Network. They've been involved in this work for a really long time, and they do work across basically Turtle Island and sharing sexual health information from this Indigenous perspective. There's a Smart Sex resource, towardtheheart.com, for harm reduction supplies, including condoms, WAVOW, which is a resource for women who have experienced violence, and it offers a place for discussion and further information, as well as the KUAS crisis line, which was mentioned at the beginning. And I think we also want to mention too that we are really excited to be hosting and helping to facilitate some of these conversations, and just to mention as well that we do have a wait list, so we're now still booking into October, but we want to partner up where we can and share this information and support these conversations to happen.
All right, that's okay. Well, thank you both. So we'll open up for question and discussion. So please, when you send your comments, and if you can, send to host and presenter, and I'll relay your questions to Len and Andrea. There was one question here around, will you be teaching how to be inclusive workshops in June to the emergency staff? Oh no, this person is teaching how to be inclusive workshops in June to the emergency staff at VGH.
Awesome.
So that's great. So any questions for Len and Andrea?
There was one question that was asked earlier around how do we get youth to the table to talk about healthy sexuality?
Yeah.
And I think one of our approaches is really recognizing that through culture, tradition, and healthy sexuality through an Indigenous lens can be woven into so many other aspects. So if we're holding like a land-based or a camp-based type of youth recreation outing, land-based learning and place-based learning are really, really powerful. And just to throw some, some healthy sexuality conversations or a presentation from a guest speaker is one of the creative ways that come with it. And then just emphasizing that healthy sexuality, can take place in so many other aspects of health and wellness. Or if we're learning about, some other type of topic in Indigenous health and wellness, mental health, those types of things that, infusing some healthy sexuality conversations in there might be good too.
Connecting with Yosnos would also be a great opportunity to ask them, as they are the experts. Everybody at YouthCo and Yosnos is under the age of 29, and they're experts in providing youth sexual health education by and for youth, so I'm sure they'll have some awesome ideas.
And Sarah said thank you for the shout out. So question, have you thought about developing a resource on how to have mindful conversations? This is such a great idea and could be helpful to have some suggestions.
I think we have had conversations about it, because we have a document for having mindful conversations around substance use and safety within our communities, and it's just something that we honestly haven't had too much time or attention paid to these types of conversations. But I think that's something that we can put out for sure.
That's great.
And from Mary here, in teaching this workshop at VGH Emergency, what would be a great resource for healthcare workers in learning to be more inclusive?
I would say that the Native Youth Sexual Health Network has an abundance of resources around healthy sexuality through an Indigenous lens. It's very youth specific, but the breadth of the resources is great. I think that's the one that comes to mind for me.
And what resources are available in the Sea to Sky corridor?
Sea to Sky corridor.
To Squamish Whistler?
Squamish Whistler. Well, we and Chimamuk and Yosmis are provincial. We have a provincial mandate, so that would encompass that. But specifically, I think we would have to look into that a little bit more.
So as you know, some of our youth quotes check up. We're very, very young, have no parents or elders to speak with. What resources are available for them through FNHA?
Well, I guess resources around healthy sexuality. We're working on creating more, but I think just in sharing some of the resources on this page, if people want further information on a specific topic around sexuality or identity or gender, I think these resources have a lot of great information. But I think for the bigger picture, I think for us it's about, we talk about this in harm reduction too, but creating these conversations for discussion around healthy sexuality and working to be an open and safe person by educating ourselves. I think that's kind of the small doable piece that we all can do.
Someone asked if you could repeat the resource that you said was good for the inclusive language.
I think it was the Native Youth Sexual Health Network, right?
Which is on the last slide, and the slides will be added to our website afterwards as well. So Soji123, do you know that? Has a great resource on discussing sexual health and gender identity. It's designed for the schools in BC and Alberta, and they've put a link in. So it's SOGIE education.org. Hi there, Dee from Urban Native Youth Association. Would love to give a shout out to any youth in Vancouver who are looking for support regarding sexual health. The Native Youth Health and Wellness Center operates youth clinic hours and sexual health education through all programming. So that's a great resource for those youth in the Lower Mainland here. And YouthCo also has an inclusive language handout that they can share. So maybe if you can send that to the Learning Circle, we can add that to our webpage as well with this. And so SOGI stands for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity. Thank you, Stacy. Okay, are there any other questions or comments or suggestions on resources? We've got a very well-informed group of people here. I'd be interested in whether people are discussing the MeToo movement in any of the workshops and conversations that you're having, if that's come up or how that's being discussed.
I would say that just the tables that we've had some brief time at throughout all the regions, I think that the MeToo movement is something that is on close to the top of the list of topics to be had in our communities. But specifically for, the type of dialogue that we host in community, we haven't had a whole lot of in-depth conversations around the MeToo movement, but just spending some time at some of the regional tables across the province with our health directors and leadership. It's definitely a topic that people are talking about. It's coming up a lot more.
And I was also curious what you see are some of the biggest challenges communities have in supporting community members to have healthy sexuality or talk about healthy sexuality.
For me, I think just opening the conversation. There's kind of certain taboos and certain feelings and ideas about healthy sexuality and who should talk about it and who shouldn't talk about it. And I think just having these sort of initial conversations is hard. I think a big part of that is the impact of colonization and the a lot of the negative sexual experiences that people have had, which makes it really difficult to talk about. I think that would be one of the biggest challenges I've seen.
Yeah, I would agree, is that the openness and willingness to have a conversation. But then again, we've had conversations with parents who are fully on board for wanting their children to have these type of conversations, but don't necessarily feel the confidence in being able to do so. Just really recognizing and honoring their own past and history around sexuality and colonization. Basically identified that they may not be the safest people, which we respect. But yeah, definitely the willingness, the aspects around trauma and willing to engage in conversations in that type of way are some of those barriers, which is why we really emphasize that starting with the wellness in general and how important it is that it's a part of all. It's not this one linear curriculum or one-off workshop conversation that we've always been. And even just reflecting on my own, sex education in it was like grade 10 or 11 or something, and it's like maybe a 1 week course that's attached to PE, and then it's just like all fear, all shameful, basically abstinence based, don't do this, don't do that. And so, there's not a lot of room for healthy dialogue, healthy questions, and a safe space for sharing. And just given what's happened over the last decade or so, I think it's come a long way. But I do see our communities are really interested in wanting to. It's a lot of confidence based on colonialism and trauma.
So from Danielle here, so I've noticed youth in care, youth removed from family are eager to have family bonds and tend to stay in codependent relationships. Do you have any advice as to how to foster healthy relationship development and be mindful of toxicity despite that need to be connected to family community.
There's quite a few in there.
Yeah,
There's a
Yes.
lot to consider, and many, many factors. When we look at youth growing up in care, trauma, grief, loss, and stress, that takes a long time for healing. And everything that we do, there's such similarities between the conversations we have within addictions and harm reduction and within healthy sexuality. And we always say that whenever we're talking about a healing journey, is that we do small, doable steps all the time, is what is achievable and where we get our own sense of progress on our healing journeys, because as Indigenous people, we're all on our own healing journey, and it's going to look different for each and every one of us. So when we talk about very specific examples of what those healing journeys might or may not be, it's definitely within the agency of the individual. What are their goals on their healing journey? What do they want to achieve that are small and doable, so that we get a sense of progress on this healing journey.
And so Mary, I think the biggest challenge as a quote white woman is how to start these conversations with Indigenous groups in the sea to sky. What would be your suggestion in starting these conversations? What would be the most useful, meaningful first step?
Again, I'm going to say very similar to our conversations around addictions, because there's when we have non-Indigenous staff in a place of facilitating or hosting or teaching, and we're talking about culture and tradition, but also trauma, grief, loss, and stress that goes along with that, and colonization, there's a power dynamic, and there's a power and privilege that we hold when we're facilitating those conversations. So we emphasize the importance of building relationships. We always say find a community champion who is a safe person, that is not fearful of healthy sexuality or non-shameful of healthy sexuality, but can hold sex positivity, can be inclusive, and has the capacity to be informed, to help to be a co-facilitator in those conversations, because that's where we see the relatedness in each other's stories, and when we can speak to each other's cultures. So I'd say relationships and co-facilitating with community champions is a great first step. And then just seeing what the strengths are in the community, always what the resources are, what's available, what is the community or the target group ready to start talking about. And I would say going back again to small doable steps with your co-facilitator.
Maybe starting with a partnership with reaching out to the health center in Squamish Nation and Mount Currie, and then maybe also if there's any Indigenous organizations in Squamish or Whistler.
Definitely. Looking at that community readiness piece is so important as well, and what conversations we're being asked to help facilitate and help hold is really important. For us not to kind of place it in the middle of the room, but to wait till we're asked to come in and share, I think is another key piece of that.
Yeah. Great. All right, well, we've got one thank you, two thank yous, and a third thank you. Any other questions, comments, thank yous at this point? Certainly want to thank you both for the conversation, and I love seeing how these conversations continue to evolve and all the pieces that come in, looking at mindfulness and culture and inclusivity. There's a lot to bring in to balance and hold these conversations in a good way. So I'm not seeing any other questions or any more, Davina, on you. So one, just thank you for this conversation. It's a valuable discussion to tap into up here in northern BC. We do have people dialed in from all over BC here, up in Skidegate and Niska and down here in Musqueam. So we've got folks all over. I want to thank everyone for participating today in this very important discussion. Thank Len and Andrea. Thank Davina and Javier. So continue to check out our webpage, and look forward to having people continue to join. So have a great day, everyone, and look forward to seeing you all again on the chat.